The Fantasy Animation Podcast takes its listeners on a journey through the colliding and sometimes competing worlds of fantasy storytelling and the medium of animation. Each episode, we select an example of fantasy animation and consider the ways in which it functions to inspire and use our imaginations within the sphere of all things that are sculpted, composed, crafted and drawn. To help support the show, please subscribe via your podcast feed and give us a like and a quick review. It takes no more than a minute, but it really helps us to grow our audience. You can also find our archive of podcasts and our weekly blog at fantasy-animation.org. You'll find the latest reviews there, features, editorials, all written by academics, writers, historians and professional animators working within these overlapping media, mediums and genres. Failing all that, tell your friends, tell a friend about the show and the good work we do here. There's no substitution for good old-fashioned word of mouth, so thanks for downloading, and I really hope you enjoy the show.
Hi listeners and welcome to the latest festive episode of the Fantasy Animation Podcast. With me, Chris, we're actually recording this in December holiday.
And Alex, pretty astounded by that, Sergeant.
Well, this is not the norm for our Christmas specials. I feel like we normally sort of... This is very much a summer job.
Yeah, normally it's too hot, isn't it? It's very hot when we're recording Christmas specials.
Yeah. Well, yeah. In the words of Noddy Holder, it's Christmas. It's Christmas, or at least it is for us, as we take a look at the 1983 short Mickey's Christmas Carol, Disney's animated retelling of the Charles Dickens masterpiece, directed and produced by longtime Disney storyboarder Burny Mattinson. I think he's actually the longest-serving employee of the Disney company, which perhaps gives listeners an idea of the pedigree of today's choice. So for me, I've got a few notes, of course, on anthropomorphism, because don't I always, but also Disney's broader connection to festive specials and perhaps their history of Christmas-themed productions that use their most beloved characters, as well as bits on Disney and technology in the 80s, animated stardom, archival and authentic voices. I'm sort of interested in the archived and the authentic voice, particularly with animation, and then the framing of Disney and Dickens as master storytellers. Alex, does this tale of Ebenezer Scrooge, played so wonderfully by Scrooge Mcduck, and we'll talk about that, in an animated version of 19th century London, veer at all into fantasy?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I feel like every year I have to talk about Dickens and A Christmas Carol on this podcast. We've done it last year with Malcolm Cook when we did animated Christmas adverts.
Yep.
We've done the Muppet Christmas Carol. We're now doing Mickey's Christmas Carol. I'd like this to be a seasonal thing. Let's get through them all over the next few years, and then I'll have nothing left to say about Dickens. I'll squeeze out what I've got left, but of course, Christmas is a time for imagining. Christmas is a time for fantasy, for stories, for fairy tales, and indeed for Disney. So I've got lots to say this week.
Yeah, well, and Christmas is also a time for receiving gifts. And what a gift in the form of our special guest for this episode. So, yes, our special guest for this seasonal instalment is Dr. Amy M. Davis, lecturer in film studies at the University of Hull, who's also author of numerous books and conference papers on. I think we both, Alex, have seen her speak many times on Disney and animation. Her books include Good Girls and Wicked Witches and Handsome Heroes and Vile Villains, as well as the editor of the book Discussing Disney from a couple of years ago, which was based on a conference that, weirdly enough, was the conference that inspired the fantasy animation journey. So there's a nice little loop going on there. Amy's also part of the fantasy animation team, first coming on board as our film and TV editor, and then soon to be moving into another exciting role that we're keeping under our Santa hats for the time being. So Amy, thank you for coming on this Christmas special episode of the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, we've wanted you on for a while and sort of trying to find the right opportunity, really. And to kick things off, I wanted to ask you something that I heard actually only a couple of weeks ago at an event on Shrek, where you gave a brief glimpse into what got you started on all things Disney. And if I remember rightly, you mentioned that it was the theme parks and the shorts that got you into Disney rather than the features. So just before we get to grips with Mickey's Christmas Carol, could you perhaps give listeners a bit more of this kind of backstory in terms of your personal and professional relationship to the Mouse House?
Yeah. So, well, it's always been there. Disney has always been there for me. And one of my earliest memories, which, is a TV memory, I'm not ashamed to say, was watching the 1950s Mickey Mouse Club on reruns on afternoon television. I would have been about 2.5, 3 years old. The shorts were playing on TV from time to time. There were, of course, Halloween specials, Christmas specials, things like that. And then when I was 5, going to Disney World for the first time. And it was just amazing and mind-blowing, and it was the perfect way to go because my parents and my little brother were actually several states away, and I was with my grandmother, who, treated me like a queen my entire life. And so, it was the best day ever. And plus, I was sort of bowled over by the fact, which I realized on that day, that she and Mickey Mouse were both born in 1928. So it was just like, it all came together. And, my parents were married less than an hour away from Disney World the month that it opened, and it's just, there were all these sort of ties that came together, and it was just like, this is the most wonderful place in the world. And I've been back many, many times. I literally have no idea how many times I've been to Disney World, because we used to live for a time when I was a kid. We lived in Florida. So on a Saturday, you want to go to Disney World, get in the car, drive about an hour, and we were there. So, with a discount, Florida resident.
So how does one turn that sort of, it's a thing we probably all struggle with when we talk about Disney, but how does one turn that childish sense of kind of joy and nostalgia and all the things that we associate with and people have many similar memories into a kind of academic engagement? Talk us through how that journey came about.
Well, for me personally, I started because I found out I could. It was when I was doing my master's, which was in modern history at UCL, and I was sort of batting around different ideas for a topic for my thesis, and I rather flippantly, after a conversation the night before with my brother, rather flippantly said to my supervisor, why don't I just do it on Disney? And his response was, well, why not? And it was, oh, I can do that? Cool. And I didn't look back. But as far as sort of taking that step back, and, going from being the fan, the in this true sense of the fanatic, to that intellectual rigor, I've not found it that hard, because I think that it is, first of all, I do have, training as a historian, so I'm used to evaluating bias and taking that intellectual and emotional step back and looking at things in kind of almost disengaged, or at least emotionally disengaged sort of way. But at the same time, I don't make it a secret that I do enjoy this stuff. I would watch Disney. I would own most of the DVDs I have for work. I would probably own them anyway, at least the Disney ones. And it's, for me, it's about not forgetting that I love it, but using that to propel me to really explore and to understand fully this thing that I have valued and treasured all my life. And I don't think it's the most perfect thing in the whole history of the world, and I will definitely say, when things are not right or whatever. But it's not as bad as some people have pretended it is. In terms of its history of, sexism and so forth, at least, which is what I get thrown at me a lot, is, princesses and stuff. I spend a lot of time talking about princesses.
Yeah.
Well, no princesses this week, at least not literal ones, because it's Christmas, and
no princesses at Christmas.
Well, perhaps that's the question. Is that Disney is known obviously for its catalogue. It's known for its back catalogue. How it selects from that catalogue is a massive question, and we have talked about it on the podcast and will continue to do so. But for now, I'd like to talk about Christmas. In that, what is Disney's relationship to Christmas? In that, it's such a big question, but it's a key. One of these key kind of cultural drivers of framing whatever Christmas means as an imaginary kind of state of being. So what does Christmas mean in terms of Disney's relationship to Christmas?
Well, Disney has always liked Christmas as a studio, as a company. It's, made Christmas-themed shorts going right back to some of the Silly Symphonies, and to some of the early black and white Mickey Mouses. So we're talking 1935 and before, they're already doing the occasional Christmas short. As television comes along, they're doing Christmas specials here and there, via the Disneyland show, and then as sort of standalone things as well. Halloween as well, but Christmas, is a real time to shine for them traditionally. When Disneyland comes along, they begin decorating it for Christmas right from its very first Christmas in 1955. And then, of course, when Disney World comes along in 71, it's the same thing. So, and it's, if you've ever been to one of the Disney parks at Christmas time, you can see just how all-encompassing, particularly in the Main Street area. Less so in other parts of the park, but still depending quite a bit. Even in places you wouldn't necessarily expect it, like the Jungle River ride and stuff, is all Christmasified. And, I personally, I don't advise going to Disney World or Disneyland on Christmas Day. It is open, but it's actually one of the busiest days of the year because the magic of Christmas plus the magic of Disney is supposed to be the best day ever. But I went once as a kid the day after Christmas, and it was the worst day I've ever had at Disney World. It was wall-to-wall people. But if you can go earlier and see the decorations and sort of get that experience, they do it beautifully. And then, of course, there are all the not just the sort of specials that are like compilations of older shorts and segments of movies and all for TV. But then they begin doing things like, A Christmas Carol, Mickey's Christmas Carol. I think it has influenced, to a degree, just how big people do decorate now for the holidays. I would actually tie it as a combination between things like, sort of Disney World, Disneyland, Martha Stewart, where it is very much about do it the biggest, the brightest, the most beautiful, leave nothing uncovered in tinsel and garland, really make this amazing, make it special. As far as tying it in, though, certainly something that going right the way back to the 1930s, something Disney has always been very good at is tying in all the different aspects of its existence. So in the 30s, that was primarily the shorts and merchandising. You don't get, of course, features until Snow White at the very end of 37, just a few days before Christmas, as a kind of almost Christmas present. But, this short, and I would personally define this as a short, it's 25 minutes, and it's my understanding that feature length is typically defined at about 45 minutes or more. And of course, it starts with the sort of a Christmassy version of the Mickey Mouse that you see at the start of the classic shorts. It had its UK premiere in October for whatever reason, but when it premiered in US theaters, it was the 16th of December of 1983. Also on the 16th of December of 1983, at Walt Disney World, was the very first ever launch of the Mickey's Very Merry Christmas Party. So this is all about that kind of, and it was certainly a big 80s buzzword, synergistic kind of, tie-ins. And that was absolutely not an accident. That was I'm sure, very carefully planned.
It's interesting. I'm glad you've brought up the date, because that's going to be, as we move on to the movie, what I was going to ask. Because as you were talking about Disneyland and Christmas and how kind of synonymous as a post-war kind of leisure culture they are, it does strike me that the two places are very, I have been to Disney World as a child, and I do remember queuing up to see Mickey Mouse, and I remember thinking I was queuing up to see Santa. And it wasn't because it was like July, and I was a pasty ginger kid in Florida, and I had no idea what to do with my skin. But it was because that's the only time you do that in Britain, is that you queue up at these kind of fairy tale things in the middle of spaces you don't really understand. The space is for once designed for you. People are looking at you, paying attention to you. You're in a big long line to meet someone, and I remember thinking, okay, why am I seeing Santa? It's like July, and then of course you meet Mickey, and the spaces are very similar, aren't they? Christmas is where we adjust our public spaces, our commercial spaces, our commercial product to speak to children, just like Disneyland. Yeah. But what's interesting about this movie, I think, in terms of its context, is we're talking about the early 80s. So this is, post the first sort of post-war boom. We're getting into Reagan, we're getting into cynicism, and I wonder if we could perhaps situate where we are with both Disney and Christmas now, because if the 50s are all, bright and colourful for some people and not for others, this is a much more grimy situation we find ourselves in, surely, both for the studio and for what Christmas might mean. I don't know. But so where is Disney in the 1980s, and why is this film made?
Well, I mean, Disney is not in a great place in the 1980s. It had been struggling for most of the 70s. Really, I would argue, since the rating system comes in the US in 1968, because before that, Disney had had a great time, certainly in the 50s and the 60s, when there was a lot of cinema going into circulation in the US without a Hays Code certification or anything like that. So you don't know when you sit down exactly what the content is. But the name Disney sort of came to stand in for something safer, wholesome, all of that. And it's not just families, it's not just kids. It's people who don't like a lot of sex and violence and stuff. But of course, after after the ratings come in 1968, they don't, Disney doesn't have that to fall back on. And particularly, I think once you get past Walt Disney's death, in December of 66, the way the studio is run is increasingly by committee, which is the worst way to run anything. They are really struggling. They can't quite reach their audience anymore. I think, you mentioned all these cultural changes and social changes that have occurred, and I don't think that those in charge had really kept up. A number of them were older people. Roy Disney, for instance, who ran things till December of 71 when he died. I believe he would have been around 80, I think, when he died. He was several years older than Walt, so he was born in the 1890s. And, so we've got older people who are maybe a little bit more out of touch, who don't understand that audience. They're concentrating also more on live action than they are on animation. Animation's more expensive, more labor-intensive. Live action they can do much more quickly and cheaply. But also, by the time you get into the 70s, into the early 80s, when my generation are the little kids, Generation X, we are a small generation. The baby boomers, obviously this was gigantic numbers of young children in the late 1940s, 50s, into the 60s. By the time you get into the 70s, the U.S. population actually slightly declines because there aren't enough live births to keep up with deaths. So there just aren't enough of us out there to just happily take whatever Disney has to offer.
But I guess we should sort of move headlong into Mickey's Christmas Carol. I've lots of interesting things to say. Well, lots of things to say about it that may or may not be interesting, but we'll come to that. But I was comparing it to Muppets Christmas Carol because I was thinking about characters and or animated characters as stars. So, Amy, could you give us a little sort of, a bit of background? So this is 1983. Disney are making a relatively short version, as you say, a 25 minute short version of Mickey's Christmas Carol, but Mickey's Christmas Carol.
I believe the original name was The Christmas Carol.
Yeah.
There's my
historian.
Yeah,
right.
Mickey was retconned in way later. Yeah.
But what they sort of added him like Hayden Christensen into the new Star Wars. They sort of put him in retrospectively, but he's not in it that much. So Mickey's Christmas Carol. What I was expecting was Mickey as the protagonist, but he is not the protagonist,
and he couldn't be. That's not who Mickey is,
Right. So that is an interesting point. So why? Who is Mickey then, and why isn't he playing the lead? Because I think there is this interesting tension, and we get it with the Muppets. But the sort of these characters, of course, they're playing these roles because their stardom dictates that they should.
Yeah.
So let's talk about that, Amy.
Well, and I mean, you can't have Mickey being mean. You can't have him being stingy or not giving to the poor. Mickey has been all about that since, roughly 1933, 34. Very earliest version of Mickey, maybe, because he was a bit of a mean little guy. But when he gets his act cleaned up, he's all about helping the poor and the downtrodden. So for him to be Bob Cratchit makes utter sense, because he is, he's a kind of, and this is something that was said about him back in the late 20s, early 30s. He's a kind of little tramp type character, like Charlie Chaplin. So for him to be poor old Bob Cratchit, long-suffering and still kindly toward his horrible boss, it has to be Mickey. And then, of course, they'd already had the Scrooge Mcduck character around for a while. So, the name's obvious. He has to be Ebenezer. But, I mean, the sort of antecedent to the special is actually a 1974 Disneyland LP, a largely spoken word album. It does actually have a few musical numbers. It's 90% the same as Mickey's Christmas Carol. I think Mickey is given top billing in the title, and not on the album, but on the special, because he's the bigger name. Obviously Mickey Mouse is more famous than Scrooge McDuck. Mickey equals Disney, so it's a great way to signpost it, and you can have cute posters with Mickey Mouse in them and all of that. And then, of course, it is actually billed as Mickey's big screen comeback. This is 1983, and his last theatrical screen appearance had been in The Simple Things, which was a 1953 short that is generally considered to be the last official of the Mickey Mouse series. And if you've seen The Simple Things, which is a cute cartoon, it's actually mostly about Pluto and some seagull who sort of takes a shine to the fish that Pluto and Mickey are meant to be using to go fishing with as bait.
Right. So that's interesting, because I was thinking, why is it called Mickey's Christmas Carol when Mickey's not much in it as much as perhaps possible? And obviously because of the reasons to do with stardom, but also it seems to be by calling it that. I mean, they could have called it Disney's Christmas Carol, right? That would have been a quite easy name for it. But by the fact they've gone with Mickey, it's that we're going back to a version of Disney that you want, but we're not Disney, we're Mickey. We're embracing Mickey's way of seeing the world rather than what has become by 1983 Disney's way of seeing the world. And that seems to be a gesture to kind of, this is a film that is trying to repurpose what a Disney cartoon embodies or whatever.
Yeah, and also I think, again, Disney had done so much live action throughout the 60s and 70s into the early 80s that really had little or no street cred. There were a few decent ones like the Love Bug films, with Herbie and all of that. But generally speaking, a lot of these films are, for all that there are those of us who have certain ones that we absolutely adore because they were, random childhood favorites, a lot of them are pretty damn lame. But Mickey Mouse, Mickey is great. Everybody loves Mickey Mouse. He is literally one of the most recognizable screen personas in history. So it makes sense to tie this to him and to sort of, he brings all these older associations. He brings associations with Walt Disney, who of course was Mickey Mouse's original voice. And Walt and Mickey were, Mickey was Walt's alter ego in most people's minds. So it's that old school Disney that they're hearkening back to, almost as if kind of ignoring all that stuff that had come, in between.
Well, with the context of the early 80s as well, like the Disney are making films like, I don't know if this is pre or post, but they're making films like Something Wicked This Way Comes. That comes out the same year, I believe. Films like Dragon Slayer, Watcher in the Woods. I mean, Disney's Christmas Carol could just as easily be kind of a gothic, macabre spectacle as anything else in early 80s. So it's this kind of, I think if we called it Disney's Christmas Carol now, there is that. I mean,
there is actually the Jim Carrey Christmas Carol that is called Disney's Christmas Carol.
Yeah, okay, interesting.
I forget what year that was. I can try and look it up.
I think it's 2009.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
That is
a much weirder, spikier movie. But perhaps that'll be next year's one, and I'll have to think of something. And I'll have to think of something else to say about Dickens. So we're Mickey's Christmas Carol. We've got Scrooge Mcduck in the main role, who I didn't know didn't originate from this movie. I remember Scrooge Mcduck from DuckTales and this film as a kid, and I just always assumed they must have repurposed him from the Carol, because why would you have a
character? You know, from all the Donald Duck comic books. I'd have to look up exactly when he makes his first comic book appearance, but it is in the 60s.
Well, he actually, according to the interweb, he was created in 1947.
Oh,
so he had. I don't know whether he then appeared in anything before the comics. It might be something where the comics sort of made him a star. But I was with Alex. All my image of him is jumping into a big pile of money. In a vault, and I'm interested in the image of the vault in relation to this film's sort of media memory, in terms of what you were saying earlier, Amy, about the nostalgia that this little short has, bypassing certain elements of history and going right back to, I was reading something about this film in terms of the Mickey Mouse universe, which obviously the word universe is something that we now like to talk when there's any kind of media crossover. But I certainly didn't get all of the references to all of the different characters in certain scenes in this, and the image of the vault is obviously something that Disney has very carefully curated. I can't remember. I think something written by David McGowan about the vault and home media, and releasing a film from the vault, which has not been available for all, and I know that James Mason has written about, another Disney scholar has written about, or I've heard him certainly speak about the imaginary of the vault, and this film this Mickey's Christmas Carol felt very much we're sort of going into a vault of or using the framework of A Christmas Carol to go back to Disney past, present, and then speculate a little on the future, and I quite like that sort of media memory element of the film.
Yeah, and some of the ones that I thought most interesting were characters being brought in from The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad, which is the last of the package features in 1949. So Mr. Toad is as Fezziwig. We have Rat and Molly, who are Toad's neighbors, of course, and friends. They play the alms collectors who come round to Scrooge's office asking for charity, for donations for charity. And then later in the projection, the Christmas Yet to Come, when we see Scrooge's grave, and you see the grave diggers, the two weasels. Those are from the weasels who helped take over, steal Mr. Toad's home, Toad Hall. So it's full of references to that. And interestingly, if you've seen Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad, the first half is the Mr. Toad half, and it's set at Christmas time in part, and certainly Toad's escape from prison after he's been found guilty of stealing a motor car. That's at Christmas time.
And he's being used in the sort of is it Fezziwig? I'm sorry, I'm such a Muppet Christmas Carol that I just think Fozziwig. But
it's Fezziwig.
The real one is Fezziwig.
Fezziwig.
Yeah. And so it's when it's the Ghost of Christmas Past. I don't think we really need to do the plot in this one.
I
everyone.
think most people
it's Christmas Carol. It's the Ghost of Christmas Past sequence, and it's interesting they use that. Is that because that film, which I know you speak about quite fondly in your work, is that because that film had a resonance in 1980s culture that it probably doesn't now, or is it because of Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, or is it a bit of both?
Possibly a bit of both. Certainly, Mr. Toad's Wild Ride was still at Disney World. It was taken away eventually. It is still at Disneyland, which I was delighted to discover and rewrite it in 2017, last time I went to Disneyland in California. But it has that, and Mr. Toad's Wild Ride was still at Disney World as well in the 80s.
Yeah. So. And what I was amazed, because there's that sequence. There's sort of it's the same sequence, isn't it? That party sequence is really interesting. There's a lot of characters in that party sequence, and I thought when I first saw these characters, okay, so what they're going to do here is they're going to draw from a canon of classical, again, I'm kind of using quotation marks, but classical Disney to kind of, because that's the era they're trying to sort of position this film within. And before this we get we've got the Mickey Brigade, we've had Goofy, we've had Donald Duck, but we've also had Jiminy Cricket as the ghost of Christmas Past. So we're very much in a certain stable. But then you also get like the cast of Robin Hood turn up to kind of clap along and dance along. So there is a messiness as to what period they're drawing from.
And
here.
Huey, Dewey, and Louie are at the party, decorating the tree. Chip and Dale are there doing a little minuet or some sort of little dance. Horace Horsecollar and Clarabelle Cow are there. You know, it's and you know those are two of the oldest of the characters. So it's and then of course Daisy as Isabel, who is Scrooge's love interest, of course, is there. So
That felt really wrong.
Yeah.
That felt really wrong. Daisy is chatting up Scrooge Mcduck.
Yeah.
That's not, even in character, that doesn't make any sense in my warped rule of Disney.
No, she should have been, you know, because Fred, Scrooge's nephew, does have a wife. She could have been his wife, and it would have been all right, but hitting on your
because
Minnie's
I mean, Minnie doesn't get a line, but she's at least in it as Emily Cratchit. Mrs. Cratchit,
So I feel like this poses a really interest when we're thinking about Disney characters, because this is a relatively, as you said earlier, Alex, we don't need to go through the plot because this is a relatively, in terms of fidelity, this is a relatively straightforward adaptation or retelling of A Christmas Carol. And we've already established that seasonal specials are very common to Disney, so this is not the first and won't be the last Christmas special, but we have a kind of trickiness when it comes to maintaining, and you mentioned this earlier, Amy, in relation to Mickey, that sort of maintaining character consistency across, I suppose nowadays it would be transmedia, but multimedia types of or you know, I suppose you get this with merchandise and the relationship between characters and merchandise, or characters and shorts and characters and features, but there's a degree which they have to be consistent, and then through certain characters like Jiminy Cricket, who is the ghost of Christmas Past, that then allows the characters, or essentially intellectual property, to reappear in these new sort of contexts, or this ahistorical context. So the fantasy, as I understand it in this film, is a sort of as a framework upon which, as I said, Disney can play with its characters. It could introduce some characters. It can remind audiences of its most beloved characters, and this sense of going back into the archive. This sort of, and I'm wondering whether a film like this is of the 80s because of the rise in home video, or the way in which there's a certain cinephilia, or there's a certain collector's sensibility, or
and as I mentioned earlier, you know, this is actually very closely based on a 1974 spoken word album released by Disneyland Records. Some of the voice cast is the same. We still have Alan Young doing Scrooge's voice. He also does Mickey on the LP, though not the Mickey's Christmas Carol. That's actually, I believe that's Wayne Allwine's very first ever Mickey Mouse appearance is in Mickey's Christmas Carol. And then it's got a few slight differences. Instead of Jiminy Cricket for the Ghost of Christmas Past, it's Merlin. Instead of Pete, formerly Pegleg Pete, as the Ghost of Christmas Future, it actually has the evil queen in her Wicked Witch form from Snow White.
Really?
Which is very odd. She sort of comes in with that cackle and, very, very short bit of the record but it's still very noticeable, very there. They don't have, obviously some of the characters, a lot of these characters we've been talking about in the background, like Mr. Toad, the Weasels, although they do speak a bit, but Mr. Toad, Minnie Mouse, some of these others, we see them, Chip and Dale, we see them, but they don't actually speak in the show or in the short. So they don't appear on the record.
Yeah, okay, so that's interesting because so we, as much as this is an attempt to kind of reclaim in a slightly messy way a certain vision of Disney that might have been lost by the early 80s, they're not quite ready to embrace the musical format. They're not quite ready to do the things that will become hallmarks of the Renaissance to come in just a few years' time. So, yeah, this is an interesting one to watch in terms of as a transitional text in that respect. It doesn't quite have the same canonization or periodization that the others have. It's a bit more kind of linear in its view of history, and also isn't quite sure what bits to take and what bits not to take yet. So that's interesting. Though I like the Wicked Witch as the Ghost of Christmas Future though. That's really cool. I think I'd have preferred that. But yeah. Who is the person that's the Ghost of Christmas Present? I'm pretty sure that's a Disney thing.
Is.
I give it a Google and it's from Fun and Fancy Free, right? Which is not one I've seen, but yeah.
That's another package feature, and part of it is Mickey and the Beanstalk, and he is the giant. So, and in fact, on the album at least, I think it's on the album, he makes reference to Jack and the Beanstalk in that character voice. And then both in in Mickey and the Beanstalk in the album and in the special, the short, he does the same little gag about not being able to pronounce the word pistachio. And sort of, pistachio, and then just changes it completely to with yogurt or something like that. So it's, very heavily linked to that giant character, who is also, of course, a character who has a lot of abundance. That's why they need to get up the beanstalk to him.
So they are casting then. It's so weird because these are not the most recognisable. I mean, I don't know. Maybe Fun and Fancy Free was massive in 1982. The
Mickey and the Beanstalk segment
was still quite big, was it? Okay, right. But, it's like, we got to take the giant from that, otherwise it won't make sense. There's a certain fidelity to casting as if they had a... rather than who are the most recognisable 8 people we can put in this movie, which is, interesting.
Although, as I say, Chris. You would have seen the Mickey and the Beanstalk shown occasionally on television. By 1983, you've got the Disney Channel in the US. It's a subscription channel, but it's there, I think it's April 1982, I think, is when the Disney Channel launches.
Wow. Okay. Interesting.
So, it's been shown on that a few times. So it's not the most recognized. He's not the most recognizable character, the Giant, and I think he doesn't even really have a name unusually other than Giant. But he isn't completely obscure by this point either. People would recognize him.
Yeah. No, well, I wanted to, I suppose, pick up a little bit on the voice, given that you've done 2 excellent impressions that will definitely end up being sound bites for this episode, Amy. This issue of the voice, and again looking at this film, but so many others where we have this was the first cartoon or the last to feature Clarence Nash voicing Donald Duck and so forth, and it's always been really interesting the role of in Disney, it seems, in lots of cases, or in predominance, the way in which sort of the voice has become a really interesting marker of authenticity, that these films need to be possessed because they are the last to feature the sort of original artist. And I know that a lot more recent, so the Disney short Get a Horse from 2013 that sort of has, I think, Jimmy McDonald doing the voice of Mickey. Or
it's Walt Disney.
Is that not right? Oh, it's they have both. They have Mickey and they have Jimmy McDonald combined together. Yeah. You have the Peanuts movie that has Bill Melendez voicing Snoopy in Woodstock, even though he died 7 years before. Paul Newman in Cars 3, Don Rickles, Toy Story 4. So there's lots and lots of instances of the voice being this sort of pulled out of the archive, reconstituted and placed into an animated context. And I think, so where are we now? So two films released this year, so Space Jam and the new Tom and Jerry, that again features snippets of the original Roadrunner or the original voices, so Mel Blanc and June Foray in the case of Tom and Jerry. So for me, this film, or we often use the voice as this authenticating marker for animation in a way that is particularly peculiar and often crops up, as I said, in these Disney instances where these films become momentous because they are the last to feature that particular iteration of the character voiced by this person. And you mentioned it a couple of times, the last voice before the mantle is passed to so-and-so. And so I was just really, I kind of find that interesting. And of course this has been supported by more sophisticated editing software and the ability to kind of keep Paul Newman on file, as it were, and then have him play posthumously. But I suppose the voice, because it's cropped up a couple of times, it seems like this short, is one of those ones where we really enjoy it, and we've got a nostalgia. The nostalgia that plays out at the level of narrative in this film is also kind of playing out for us now, sonically, because these are the last times we hear these people.
The last times or the first times is, Clarence Nash's last as Donald, Wayne Allwine's first as Mickey. And, he was the longest serving voice for Mickey Mouse. Jimmy McDonald does it technically for roughly the same number of years, but he's not the only one doing Mickey's voice during the time he's doing it. Other people, to include Clarence Nash, actually, and Alan Young, would pitch in and do Mickey from time to time. So to do it consistently, Wayne Allwine did it longer than anyone else. And then, of course, very famously, from, I think, 1991, was married to Russi Taylor, who, of course, was Minnie's voice. So Mickey and Minnie were married in real life, as it were.
But then this raises, I suppose, other questions of impersonation, and of course the transmedia or the post-cinema afterlives of these characters, where the reason or one of the powers of the star voice is that it can then be impersonated. So we have even if characters don't want to perform, or it's not part of their contract to perform as the doll or the video game, it doesn't matter. Jay Farrow can do the donkey in Shrek. It doesn't have to be Eddie Murphy. But it does mean that as part of the consistency of character, in terms of we can't have Mickey playing this character because we have to have a coherency to his performances and his characterization and personality. We can't go against his personality. There's a sonic element to this, in that any subsequent iteration of, and I think this happens a lot with the Warner Brothers, you have characters that you have to sound like, and even Kermit the Frog, you have to have new voices that maintain that consistency. You can't. So it's really about impersonation, and of course this has been sharpened, I think, recently when it comes to white performers voicing black characters on programs like Family Guy and The Simpsons, and I think the producers of Family Guy sourced a voiceover went online and found a voice artist who could impersonate Mike Henry, who was doing the voice of Cleveland, and so that to allow for a seamlessness of casting. But I mean, the star voice is obviously interesting in lots and lots of ways for animation. But no, I think Disney is one of those studios where I've often heard the role of the authentic voice more so than other studios. Maybe Warner Brothers, as I said, but Disney, this sort of passing of the baton that is really important for the consistency of these characters.
Well, because these characters are they're so important to so many people. They're almost like an extra member of the family. They are just part of special times, visits to Disney World or Disneyland, all the holiday stuff, all of the movies and the shorts and all of that mean a lot to people. And then, of course, the way Mickey in particular, and I think he's probably the most protected persona, others might occasionally be, they might toy with casting them a slightly, if not entirely, against type. They would never be able to do that with Mickey. I think it would be too upsetting to too many people. But equally, I don't know how much Mickey's persona would allow that, because he becomes very much the straight man and, kind of boring. In a way.
This is what I was thinking. I was thinking the problem with Mickey Mouse is that he's not really allowed to do anything, is he? Because drama requires some level of character development, crisis, flaws, something. And I, that's another reason why they perhaps found it more and more difficult to make Mickey Mouse cartoons. Is that actually the only way you can really use him is to have him pop up in things like this, do the nice bit for 2 minutes, and then sort of sit in a corner, because it's like this. Sources of Apprentice is the other big one he's known for, where again he's only he's not the driving force of the narrative. It's people off screen. I was struck by how little Mickey does in this. Not just how little he's in it, but how little he the Bob Cratchit cover is very subservient, but this is a particularly subservient version of the Bob Cratchit character.
And I mean, you don't really get much done of interest with Mickey that focuses on Mickey until it was the 2000s, I think about 2004 or 5, when you get the new series of Mickey Mouse shorts, it's really a TV series, The Wonderful World of Mickey Mouse, where the characters are very, very redesigned into a look that you can best define as kind of retro. They're modern, but they're very much hearkening back to sort of early color Mickey, but also in a much more sort of mid-century vibe. You have Mickey, Minnie, Donald, Goofy, Pluto, Daisy, with occasional visits from other characters. And this time, Mickey is allowed to be slightly more of a troublemaker, to get into scrapes and into difficulties, to have wild things happen to him, and therefore he becomes interesting again. And they've actually managed to have a number of seasons of this series of Mickey Mouse shorts because they've basically said, let's stop making him such a nice guy. Let's bring back some of that slightly meaner aspect, naughtier aspect that he used to have.
But that surprises me in lots of ways, because I would imagine, and I guess my comparison here is something like the Minions, the ability of the Minions to be themed. So the themeability of Minions in relation to transforming a Minion from yellow to purple, and that's a monster, or putting a Christmas hat on them and they're that sort of way in which characters can be themed across merchandise, and I was just wondering or thinking that in this case it would make sense that Mickey is relatively, I don't want to say bland, but relatively themeable, because it then allows a lot of these characters to move malleable, but it allows them to move into different seasonal holidays with relative ease. But there's only so far that will get you, as anyone who's seen the third Despicable Me will know, but there's only so far that will get you. And I was just in terms of the Mickey's not allowed to do anything, I thought, well, that kind of makes sense, because he has to fulfill so many different roles in so many different media enterprises and products, and he has to be themed in lots of ways. And it just struck me that it makes sense that he retains that element of an archetype, because he can then be transplanted into Halloween, to Christmas, to whatever
and
it
I've
is.
Personally own Halloween, Thanksgiving, and Christmas merchandise related to him. I've seen Hanukkah related merchandise, other sorts of, 4th of July, all of these kinds of things where he can just be recostumed and slightly reworked. And even in, again, some of these specials that have come along in much more recent years, there was one just last month, in October, on the Disney Channel. It's still November in my head. In October on the Disney Channel.
But of course it's Christmas Day now.
Oh, absolutely.
Amy.
The mistletoe is right above my door here. It's where they're meant to be telling scary stories, and they take on this very, sort of, Mickey becomes this very monstrous character who's telling these terrible stories to scare the kids. And I actually just recently came across online a 2022 wall calendar where it's all Mickey and Minnie, but it's all a kind of gothic vampiric Mickey and Minnie for each month. So, Mickey the vampire is just as acceptable in that way, because it's done very tongue-in-cheek, as, Mickey the sweet little Bob Cratchit, or, Victorian Christmas character.
I was actually going to ask, and I've decided not to, but I'm going to ask it now, because that last thing provoked the thought in me. In that, I guess this is a question kind of on the back of what Chris was saying about voices. And it's a bit of an impish question, but why are we so worried that Mickey sounds right when actually Mickey comment you made about him looking the same, but actually he
changes
hasn't
all the time, but his essentialness stays the same. He's still the three circles,
Sure. So there's still that, the sort of the Eiffel Tower emblem, as I remember, for sort of the water tower in I'm calling it MGM Studios.
Hollywood Studios.
I think it's Hollywood
Disney's
Studios now, because I have decided I'm old enough in life where I'm just going to cling on to how things used to be called, like my parents
Works
did.
for me.
Fine. But he does change, just like the voice, he changes, and it's the voice might find but actually the design changes, the animators who make him change, and we've talked often on the podcast about animators being animation being a performance, and that you're in dialogue with the character. So why, it's not just the voice that we're trying to sort of, I don't know, fix into a definite model that was never there, but we're trying to do it with lots of elements of this character. Maybe the reason he's so flexible is that he's never actually as defined as we perhaps even the studio would want him to be.
So I would say, building on that though, is that the voice then, because the character has these modulations, the voice becomes this repeating constant, and that for me is what makes Mickey a star, because we expect stars to sound a certain way unless they change or affect an accent, or they, if you're Meryl Streep, you affect an accent and are incredible, but we expect stars to sound a certain way, which is why they're so good for voice work, but it also allows a level of consistency. And the same is true of Mickey. We expect him to sound a certain way, and even though animators come and go, and crucially, he may become digital, he may be digitized,
he has been.
And he's not just. He has been, exactly.
Yeah.
So it's not just I remember the kind of furore of, I think there was some new Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner shorts, Coyote Falls, I think, and it was one of the first to be digital. And you sort of think, well, these characters don't look like that. The stars, and the same is true. And this is why I think we can read them as stars in terms of modulating appearances and the way that they inhabit these roles and so forth. But the voice becomes this authenticating factor that is supposedly constant. So that allows us to maybe forgive these modulations, which is why impersonation, it becomes such an important element
and that's
of animated
and that's
characters.
basically what I mean. What I'm saying is, we're so used to appearance changing that when the voice changes only the voice changes, it's a bit sort of what's going on there. And they've, as you mentioned, the Muppets, and of course, when Jim Henson passed away, they handed Kermit over to Brian Henson, Jim's son, hoping that, being the son, his voice, but everybody can tell, and you get gags all over. I always think of, there's a gag in Family Guy where one of the characters, I think it's Stewie, says something about, taking chickenpox seriously. Jim Henson didn't take chickenpox seriously, and now what do we have? Wrong sounding Muppets. But then there are also things like I remember hearing about many years ago, probably 15, 16 years ago, about the Mexican Simpsons voices went on strike. And they tried bringing in other actors to do their voices for the Mexican broadcasts of The Simpsons, and even tried bringing in big stars to do the voices from Mexican cinema and TV, and audiences just weren't buying it because that wasn't how these characters sounded. And I've always found it fascinating because I've seen dubs of, The Muppet Show and South Park, The Simpsons, a few others in multiple languages, to include Irish Gaelic. Living in Northern Ireland when analog TV was still around, you'd occasionally get, I think it's pronounced Teige Cahar, which is the Irish language channel from the Republic. So, the Muppets Show in Gaelic is brilliant because the guest stars still speak English, but the Muppets are in Gaelic. I've even seen SpongeBob SquarePants in Gaelic. And they still cast, for all that these are different languages, voices that are similar. Marge Simpson is recognizably Marge Simpson, not identically, but recognizably in any language that she's speaking in. And I think it is just, they decide voice matters, accent matters, because it tells us about the personality. And of course, within animation, it's a wonderful shorthand for a character. I mean, with my students, I always do, when we talk about this a bit, I always use Lois Griffith as my contact point, where she's got that very New England, sort of nasal accent, and when she yells at, it's always Peter, get in here. But imagine if she suddenly, Peter, get in here. Suddenly she's from a different part of the U.S. She's of a different class. She's, all kinds of things have suddenly shifted quite dramatically about her because of just that change of accent. So it matters. And I think it matters more than the appearance for all that
it's
that
interesting
matters.
that it's interesting then as a note that obviously this started as an audio project then, right? Yeah, this is all about voices on a tape that then decided to be visualized. So that primacy that you're articulating is there in the production of this movie. So that's
but
interesting.
Then the adaptation starts on a record, but of course those voices predated it. So we knew.
So this short is the ultimate in Mickey Mousing then, because they've got an audio source and they've fit the images to the sound.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the voice thing is as you were saying, Amy, the industrial undergirdings of the voice, and even we expect dubbed stars or dubbed animated characters to sound a certain way, and stars across national borders being stars for voicing particular, or voice actors becoming stars for voicing particular. I'm the Daniel Craig of. I mean, because you said The Simpsons and I mean, I'm thinking of Senor Spurs, or was it Spielberg
Yes.
or something like that? Yeah. No, but there's lots to say about voice and accent in animation. And I think, and something like Mickey's Christmas Carol really does. Yeah, raise some interesting stuff around the buried voice in an archive, or a voice that you don't kind of no longer hear. We're getting to time, so I guess.
Yeah, I've got Christmas shopping to do, everyone. We're gonna have to wrap this up. I haven't bought my gifts
any
yet.
fantasy bits, Alex.
Right, it might be all imaginary at this rate.
I've already done all my Christmas shopping.
Nice.
Of course you have. It's Christmas Day.
Yeah. Where have you been?
This is as temporally confused as the carol itself. I think that's about it. I mean, we managed to get a lot out of 24 minutes of material there, but I think it's nice to touch on the wider issue of sort of, Disney's role in Christmas. And I think the only thing I've got left to say is that, I said I'd say something about Dickens, and I think it's such a good story to use, because Dickens, and I think we've talked about this on previous episodes where we've done versions of it, but Dickens's original carol is so slippery in terms of what it's trying to say, because it's on one hand so anti-commercial, you would think, in its story of this miserly man who learns the power of generosity and all this sort of stuff, and yet it also gives birth to many of the things that we obsess about buying at Christmas time, and the way the way it embodies that contradiction at the end of Scrooge basically learning to give by learning how to buy is quite a it's quite a Disney-esque, dare I say, parable of warmth and generosity, and here's the gift shop, and that contradiction is there, but in source and in tone. So I think I think it was well worth a revisit, and thank you, Amy, so much for helping us through it. Absolutely, thanks so much.
It was fun to talk about it. Thank you for having me.
Chris, do you have any other Christmas cheer to spread, or?
No, well, yes, but no, I suppose I did mention it at the start in relation to technology, and this is really a little footnote, but lots has been written about animation and Disney's relationship in particular within that to technology, but I suppose a little shout out to the 1980s in terms of Disney's encroaching experiments with computer graphics, and Mickey's Christmas Carol sort of pioneers this a new sort of.
Yes, we haven't talked about that. There is a new technology that you're going to have to tell me all about, because I glazed over as I start reading about it on Wikipedia.
I mean, there's lots of stuff around, and Amy will know more about this than me, but the 101 Dalmatians, lots of online forums that are called things like, why does 101 Dalmatians look like that? And connecting that to the Xerox process, but the APT process, animation photo transfer, where the sort of ink is photographed directly onto or transferred directly onto acetate cells. This film is sort of playing with that. I don't really know too much about it. I suppose we can fold it into a bigger. Disney was, I suppose, starting to experiment with different ways of producing animation in the lead up to what would become a very successful integration of
I know that with Dalmatians anyway, it's a process that Ub Iwerks, one of the sort of co-designers of the original Mickey Mouse, it's a process he came up with that Walt really disliked it, but it won in terms of budget, and later he sort of grudgingly said, well, I guess it looks all right, kind of thing. But that's
it. I suppose a little note. Disney has often been positioned, I suppose, historically within a relationship to technology, sound, color.
Well, they're pioneers in one way or another from so much of that.
And that's really, I suppose that's really, that feeds into the way that Walt has been. I mean, we haven't really talked about Walt and Charles Dickens as storytellers, and I suppose the last note I've got on the film is the way that the image, I think the final animated image, becomes crystallized as an illustration, and I thought that was a really nice end of the film. But no, nothing else from me. So I'll leave you, Alex, to do the obligatory admin, because I can't do it.
Okay. Terrific. I feel like I'm like the dad who has to clear up after the gift wraps now. I've got to clear up the living room because you've all run out of the room playing with your toys. But all right. Well, first, not admin, but a delight. Amy, thanks one more time for coming on the podcast. It was a really pleasure to have you on. If listeners wanted to find out more stuff about Disney, if they wanted to follow your work, you have a Twitter handle, I believe.
Do.
Why don't we plug it?
It's at Dr. just Dr. Amy M. Davis. Davis without an
nice
E.
and easy. Okay, nice and easy. Please do follow her on that and take up with your latest projects. Your books are still available to buy on Amazon and actually a relatively healthy price for it compared to some academic work.
Yes.
So people can go out there and spend their hard-earned Christmas their Christmas money, because it's already been Christmas, in the January sales. There we are. The tortured analogies continue. There we go. Cool. Otherwise, a very Merry Christmas to you all. God bless us, everyone. We have been Fantasy Animation. That's been us for 2021. What a year it has been, and 22 probably will not be without some dramas, but we'll be there with you all the way. We're going to take a little bit of a break just for a couple of weeks while we recharge our batteries. So we'll see you in the new year with some more episodes and some more fun things lined up. Some of which we've recorded already, so we're excited to share them with you. But keep an eye on your podcast feeds and on your social media handles, and we will return in due course. Don't worry. You can do that by following us at FanAnim Research, FANANIM Research, at Twitter or on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram, as well as fantasy-animation.org. And I'll tease you with this. Do you have a question for Chris and I that we keep going on about in a podcast that you've always wanted us to explain? A question in the air about anything to do with fantasy animation that you want Chris and I to answer in 10 minutes or less? Send us an email, fananimresearch, FANANIM research @gmail.com, and we will answer it in a form to be revealed in the new year. Otherwise, thank you very much for listening, and I wish you a happy holiday and a very happy new year.
Bye.